My name's Gord Sleebert with the Canadian Sports Centre Pacific, and I'm here interviewing physiologist Stacey Hutton. The topic that we'll discuss today is incremental blood lactate testing, and Stacey has written a performance point on this topic. So Stacey, it's common to measure an athlete's blood lactate response to exercise, and indeed many physiologists use little handheld analyzers to monitor blood lactate, and coaches even can do this themselves sometime. When you're analyzing the response an athlete has to exercise with blood lactate, what are you really looking for?
Well, I think when we're analyzing their blood lactate levels during exercise, we really want to get a snapshot as to what's happening within their bodies in terms of their metabolism, like how much aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism they're relying on to meet their energy demands at the intensity that they're at.
So if we're monitoring an endurance athlete that is involved in an event that is largely fueled by aerobic metabolism, what are you looking for in terms of, a typical exercise test? I guess exercise intensity gradually ramps up and we reach a certain point and blood lactate response takes off. Can you explain how you would use that information to interpret perhaps an athlete's fitness level back to them?
Well, when we're looking at their increasing intensity and we're looking at their corresponding lactate levels, we can sort of see where the transitions happen. Usually we can see a transition where their lactate levels sort of stay the same for a while, and then once they start to go up, we sort of know that they've changed and they're starting to rely on a little anaerobic metabolism a little bit more. But they're usually sort of able to, it's a nice sustainable mix of aerobic, anaerobic, depending on the increment size in the test. But then there comes another point where it really takes off. And it has different names, lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold. But that's sort of the point where we sort of realize whether or not it's their intensity that they can sort of theoretically maintain.
So if an athlete was more aerobically fit, then they would be able to exercise at a higher intensity without accumulating substantial amounts of blood lactate.
Correct.
And is there a certain level above which blood lactate rises that's typically associated with not being able to sustain that exercise intensity?
Do you mean an absolute lactate level?
Yes.
Well, people commonly rely on 4 millimoles as one, but it's better, I think, to look at more the change in lactate level with an increasing workload. But yes, 4 millimoles is something that is commonly referred to as sort of a reference point. Beyond that, it sort of becomes an unsustainable.
Okay, so if I have a blood lactate level, so I'm riding my bike and my blood lactate is sitting at around 6 or 7 millimolar, it's pretty likely that I will fatigue fairly rapidly at that rate. Whereas if I was at a lower blood lactate, say 3 millimolars per liter, I could sustain that exercise intensity for a fairly long time.
Absolutely, I'd say that's correct, although you definitely have individual responses in different people.
Are there some individuals that perhaps can sustain exercise at 5 or 6 millimolar lactate for prolonged periods of time?
I have one cyclist that maintains around 10 in a time trial that lasts about a half hour.
So it's very, very individual.
Yes.
Excellent. And let's say, as an athlete, I came in and I was tested in, September. Then I did a lot of aerobic training, and I came back into the lab to see you in early December. What would you expect to happen to my lactate curve or my lactate response with exercise?
Well, hopefully you'd reach a higher intensity in keeping your lactate lower. So in essence, the curve would shift to the right and downwards if you were looking at the curves overlapping one another on the same graph. Yeah, so hopefully you can reach an intensity and that lactate level will be lower.
Can you use that information to prescribe training zones for athletes?
Yeah, you can prescribe training zones based on where you see those transitions happen. So if you want to train aerobically versus anaerobically and mixes in between there, then you use those deflection points in the curve essentially to sort of pick off heart rate training zones for the athlete.
So for example, if I was looking for some guidelines to make sure I wasn't exercising too hard on a recovery day, What sort of lactate levels would you utilize to anchor that recommendation?
I'd rely on the lactate levels that are sort of resting like. Again, it's individual, but generally it's 2 and below.
Okay, and then conversely, if I wanted to do some high intensity training that was a real mixture of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, I take it then you would prescribe training that was associated with lactate levels much higher than 4 millimolar, which you said was sustainable for prolonged periods of time.
So if I'm in the sustainable one, yeah, I'd say somewhere between the intensities between 2 and 4. Yeah, but at the high intensity ones, yeah, usually a higher intensities higher lactates.
Okay. And do you think there's, do you think that athletes or coaches for that matter utilize this information pretty strategically by and large to define how their training looks like over a microcycle or over a mesocycle?
I think we see a wide range. I think we definitely have some coaches that rely on it a lot and really do look at the curves and the shifts in the curve and prescribe from the curve, but then I think there's others that probably don't, or maybe do the lactates just because they know it's useful, but maybe don't actually know how to use it as best as they could.
So maybe it is something that you need to think a lot about and work with a physiologist to understand how to apply it.
Yeah, and it's not just getting a curve and looking at that. You have to know how the test was run. You have to know what the stage durations were, the jumps in increment size, where all those factors will affect how the curve looks. So you have to understand how the test was run to make sure you interpret the results correctly.
Are there any occasions when an athlete comes in for testing and they're just unable to produce a really high lactate?
Yes, you can see that when sometimes if someone's glycogen depleted, they can't always produce lactate.
So why is that?
Well, in terms of why they...
Yeah, why does glycogen depletion impact an athlete's ability to produce high levels of blood lactate?
Well, they're not relying, or they're unable to rely on carbohydrate sources to meet their energy demands.
So I guess it's very important when an athlete comes in for testing, or a coach refers an athlete in for testing, that they have had some recovery prior to the lab test, that they have consumed adequate amounts of carbohydrate, for example.
Yes, if they're coming into our labs, and we almost always give them pre-test instructions or refer them on to the pre-test preparation performance point that we had a while ago, where we tell them to be well rested, to eat a carb-heavy meal beforehand, make sure they're not depleted in glycogen, to ensure that they're actually following a standardized pre-test meal. That's ideal. So hopefully they are referring to that.
Hopefully they are, yes. And in terms of monitoring somebody's training status or providing regular feedback in terms of modifying the training zones that may be prescribed off of a lactate curve, how often would you recommend athletes to come into the lab and be assessed?
Well, I think it sort of depends on what their training macrocycles look like. Like I would say before they start their big pre-season, before they start to accumulate base, to sort of get a snapshot of what they're like beforehand, get the appropriate training zones, and then when they've sort of figured that or finished that big cycle off, then that's usually a good time after then. And maybe also leading right up into pre-competition, I would say. Okay,
so it's not like you come in every 6 weeks. It's how to look at the periodized training plan and pick strategically times at the beginning or end of transitions in the training, or general prep to specific prep phases, those sorts of things.
Yeah, or if in an individual response, like if someone was injured, to see if they're coming back appropriately in terms of their fitness, something like that.
What's the highest blood lactate you've ever seen in the lab?
Oh, good question, Gord. I don't know. I'd say it's been around 18-ish, or around 16-ish. I haven't seen it higher than that.
Okay.
How about you?
I've seen over 18
Have you?
per liter in a swimmer. So some individuals have seen lactate responses of over 20 millimoles per liter, And certainly I think there's factors that might predispose athletes to producing certain amounts of lactate. And I guess it's an anomaly to say we're producing blood lactate, isn't it? When we talk about blood lactate, the lactate is being produced in the muscle and cleared to the blood, so it's an indirect indicator of anaerobic metabolism to some extent.
It is.
And what would you recommend for athletes that are generating huge amounts of lactate? What's the best way to clear lactate after they've competed or after they've trained?
Active recovery, so not just stopping exercise altogether, but to be at a workload where they're going to clear it more so than produce it. So that again is based on, we'll get that intensity from the lactate curve, pick out a point where it's before their first deflection. So
an intensity high enough that they may actually be burning that lactate up as a fuel. Yeah, it is a carbohydrate after all, but not so high that production in the muscle is exceeding removal.
Correct.
Right. And how do we remove lactate? Like if active recovery, where's the lactate going when you're exercising? Where does it go?
Well, it's being used by the muscle itself, the active muscle itself, in terms of being oxidized by the muscle.
So it's actually burnt up as a fuel. Yeah. So I guess take-home message actually is we think about lactate as being something bad that's produced in muscle, but we can actually use it as a fuel.
Yeah,
burn it up as a fuel. So it's not, and it is necessary to produce lactate if we want to generate very, very high levels of power, isn't it? Because the aerobic system can't generate those super high levels.
Yeah, and not very quickly.
Yeah, that's right. Do you know how quickly we start to produce lactate at the onset of intense exercise? If it was an all-out sprint, for example, do we produce lactate in the first 5 seconds?
Well, yes, we are generating lactate all the time, right? But we're also going to be using other modes of energy production in the initial going. We'll rely on the ATP, CP as well.
Yes, so the phosphagen system is really important in that short duration, super high intense exercise. And I guess this sort of leads me into a question. What types of athletes are typically being monitored with incremental blood lactate testing? Probably not your sprinters, like your 100-meter sprinters. I guess it's
It's mostly endurance-based ones, especially those that want to have a prescription available. But the other sports that want to just get a snapshot for fitness too, they will sometimes do that as well. But it is mostly endurance-based sports.
And so by other sports, I guess you're meaning sports where an aerobic base is important for recovery or as a fundamental aspect of making sure they're fit enough to deal with the other types of training stressors or competition stressors that they experience.
Yeah, exactly. Like some of our alpine or freestyle skiing.
Sure. Okay. That's great. Stacey, is there anything else you'd like to mention with respect to incremental blood lactate testing, i.e. how much fun it is for the athlete?
Oh, they love us. They love us. No, I do, but I just want to stress the quality control aspect of it. And that you'll only get as good of data as your means of collecting it. So you need to actually do a really good job at getting that sample. So making sure that your equipment's calibrated and you have a really clean surface that you're working with, it's crucial to getting good numbers.
Well, thanks very much for talking to me today about incremental blood lactate testing.
Thank you, Gord.